Hello, everyone. Welcome to this information session on procedures for review of human research ethics application forms. My name is Sean Lacey, and I'm the Research Integrity and Compliance Officer for the university. Now, the main focus for this information session is on the procedures that we have in the university around the review of human research ethics application forms, but maybe just to kind of set the scene to human research ethics. And I suppose what are the expectations on us as researchers from our policy? But I mean, most of the time we'll be spent talking about the procedures, and we will have time at the end for some questions as well. Okay. So I suppose first and foremost, it is important to call out that any research that we do involving humans as participants requires that there's research ethical review prior to the commencement of the research. Okay, and that's first and foremost. And I thought that does not matter at what level we're doing this, okay? That if it's research involving humans, and it doesn't matter whether it's a PhD we're doing, whether we're staff doing research, whether we're looking at maybe, we'll say, our undergraduates doing research, taught postgraduates and so on like that. If it's research that involves humans as participants, there needs to be ethical oversight prior to the commencing the research, okay? And research ethical oversight or ethical approval is not granted retrospectively, okay? Then it comes to look, well, what is research that involves human participants? And these are things that are called out in our actual in the policy. And I'm always slow, and those that might have attended previous seminars, workshops, webinars, I mean, you'd notice that I'm always slow in putting together a list because I never feel a list is exhaustive. Okay, there can always be other scenarios. So that's why I say here, these are examples. It's including but not limited to. Okay, so because there can be other scenarios. So if we're looking at data collection or research involving humans, that is through questionnaires, focus groups, observations, interviews, maybe data that has already been collected, maybe it's anonymous data sets that we have, or maybe we're conducting research over the internet, maybe using social media and so on like that. They are all types of research that involve human participants, and so ethical oversight is required. Okay, and I think that that's first to kind of get that, and that's again this is called out in our policy. Okay, and then just to kind of get a sense of what our policy says. Okay, so firstly, our policy, and this obviously feeds into the procedure as well. So that's why I think I have around 9 or 10 bullets that I want to cover here, but they all kind of feed into the procedure. So that's why I'm mentioning these as well. Okay. So our policy says that when we're submitting a research ethics application form, that we need to show evidence of research ethics training. Okay, so that's the first thing. And there's a couple of avenues around that. And I know Lydia has popped the link into our webpage into the chat. And on the webpage, there was, I suppose, guidance on the, options available when it comes to training certification. And we'll touch on that as well. Okay, but I suppose, so it's called out in our policy, but there are resources available to support this. Okay. The next one then is we have a Human Research Ethics Committee in the university. The Human Research Ethics Committee, the HREC, they facilitate the ethical review of postgraduate research and staff research. Okay, so postgraduate research are our research masters and our PhD students, and then obviously staff research is obviously what it says. Okay, the HREC don't have the capacity to be looking at to be providing ethical oversight of undergraduate and taught postgraduate research, but very much aware that that does happen. There is research at undergraduate and taught postgraduate level. It's just that does not go to the HREC. That is handled that's handled at academic unit level. Now, what way that is handled can vary depending on the academic unit. And the academic unit could be a department. Equally, the academic unit could be a school. It could be a faculty. It varies, okay? It does vary. The other thing then to be aware of is when it comes to our students. So if our master's or PhD student are submitting a research ethics application form to the HREC, it is the PI or the supervisor that submits it. Now, to be very clear, it's not necessarily that the PI or the supervisor that's writing it or completing the ethics application form, but it is on this PI or supervisor to submit it to the HREC. So the student, research master's or PhD student, should not be submitting an ethics application form to the HREC. And if they do, it'll just be returned to them. Okay. And the last thing just on this slide then, it's, I suppose, when we submit an ethics application form to the HREC, it shouldn't, and I'm not saying anybody does this, a disclaimer, but it shouldn't be like, oh, let's put a card to the NCT and see what it comes out with, okay? Ideally, it should be in good shape. Now, before a car, ideally should be in good shape before it goes to an NCT. Equally, an ethics application form should be in relation to a research study that is in good shape, has been designed well before it goes to the HREC, okay? So it's not a case of, oh, we throw that in, let's see what they come back with. If on review, there's a lot of holes or gaps in it, it will just be returned. Okay, so it's important that the appropriate research design on the study is done before submitting the work to the HREC. Other things then to be aware of is we're very much aware that research studies can change. I mean, it can happen, it happens regularly, okay? If you have had a study that has had research ethical approval and your study has changed, there's no issue with that whatsoever. But if your study has changed that has ethical implications, it's important that you let the HREC know of this. And we have a form that's up on the webpage to actually help with this, to kind of streamline it. Look, if there's an amendment to research ethics application form that has been approved, what do we do? And that information is up on the webpage as well. Okay. And again, it's not an issue. It definitely isn't. But I suppose if a study changes drastically, then maybe you're probably better off maybe just doing a new ethics application form as opposed to an amendment. But there are things that can be discussed. Okay. Call out in our policy that when we finish, and so when I say we as kind of as researchers finish a study, it is important that an end of study report is submitted to the HREC, because if you think about it, the HREC would be given approval to continue to conduct certain research. So then it's important to kind of close that out small, to kind of let the HREC know when that research is now being finished. Okay, and that's a short form, but this is to kind of close that out, close that loop. And that is called out in our policy as something that should be done. The other thing, and this is really important, I'm actually sorry, no, I personally feel that all of these points are important, but this is just something because it's just so easily done, maybe by mistake, that if an external researcher reaches out to one of us and asks us, look, could you share this survey among your students or something like that, and it's for research purposes, the answer there should be, well, yes, we can, but you need to get ethical approval first. So ethical approval, and it's in our policy, applies to external researchers looking to gain access to our students or to staff. And that's really, really very important, okay? Because we can't be going off and promoting or kind of drawing attention to a research study internally that involves human participants, but has not got ethical approval. We cannot be doing that, okay? So it's really important that if somebody externally reaches out to us, asking us to disseminate or to share, that they go through the ethical review process first. Okay, and that's really important. And it's not that we're against sharing, most definitely not. We just need to make sure that it follows good practice. Okay. And the last thing then on this one is, and it's just think this is important and it feeds into the fourth bullet point there, is that the university does reserve the right to overrule another ethics committee. So if an external researcher has ethical approval from their local ethics committee, but our university feels, look, that maybe more information is needed, it's not stringent enough, the university has the right to overrule that other ethics committee. And that's, again, it is called out in our policy. Okay. So other things then to maybe just, so there are the different things on the policy, but obviously this this information session today is about the procedures, and that's really what I do want to focus on. But I want to kind of give a small bit of background information on the procedures. So the procedures that we're talking about were approved by the Research Council and Academic Council in May last year, okay? But they have been trialed out beforehand, okay? So kind of giving a small bit of history to this. So the HREC was established in November 22, so that's nearly a year ago now at this point. What was done is draft procedures were drafted, and they were essentially road tested before formally going off for approval. And so these procedures were noted by the two registrars and by the Research Council. So there was an awareness that the HREC was established, and they were trialing these procedures to see, the particular procedures that they were using, do they actually work? Okay, it felt it was too easy to nearly go off and seek approval of the procedures, and then you road test them and it falls at the first hurdle. So what we did is we worked off draft procedures, then road tested them, and then basically got feedback on them. So we road tested them for 4 months, kind of recorded feedback on the procedures from the HREC members and also from applicants that would have gone through the process, updated the procedures where appropriate. That would have been done in April last year, or sorry, April this year. And then the procedures that we have were formally approved by the Research Council and the Academic Council in May. Okay, and they're the procedures that are linked, that were linked in the email that would have been shared when promoting this information session. And those procedures are in detail are up on the webpage as well. Okay. So that's, I suppose,
Sean,
yep,
sorry to interrupt. There is a question in the chat.
Perfect.
It's in relation to the previous slide. Do you want me to read it out now, or do you want to leave it till later?
I'm reading it there now. Sorry, yeah. I mean,
okay.
So data collection, really, I'm just would be the one there. I'm reading it out for the sake of the recording, as opposed to anything. So presumably students are still free to work away on their literature review and early methodology before the ethics submission, given that helps most of them shape their primary research report. Absolutely, no doubt. The expectation isn't that they immediately try to get ethical approval. No, I agree completely with the sentiment to that. I suppose the key thing is there should be no data collection before ethical approval. Equally, potential participants should not nearly be contacted before ethical approval either. Okay, so we don't want to be contacting somebody and say, look, I'm going to go through the ethical review process. I'll be back in touch maybe in a month, but watch out for my email or something like that. We don't do that, okay? But I would think how I'd look at it is maybe in parallel with the literature review or the methodology, that the ethics application form could be progressed or something like that. But that obviously very much varies depending on the actual study. Yeah, perfect. That was a great question. Thanks very much. And no problem ever being interrupted there, okay? Thank you, Lydia, as well. Okay, so what we have is we've two procedures, two kind of formal procedures. And if you look at the documents that are online, there's a lot of information in them, okay? And the two procedures are how the HREC conduct their work. But I just want to summarize them on this slide. And as you can appreciate, when something, that's 20-page document is summarized in a slide, it can't be exhaustive. But it just gives a sense of the procedures and how we're actually working in the HREC. So this first procedure is around the ethical review for university staff and research students. And then the second one is about the external researcher, okay? So just to kind of give you a sense of it. So what happens is an application is submitted to the HREC. So HRE, there's an abbreviation that will come up now in a minute, but HRE is Human Research Ethics. HREC is obviously Human Research Ethics Committee, okay? So an application is submitted. The application then is screened, okay? So it's screened by the HREC administrator, which is Lydia Biscoe-Flaherty. So Lydia screens the application, and then based on this, the screening, is the application ready to review? Now, the screening basically is to make sure that everything is included in the application. Look, that if you're conducting a survey, are indicative questions at the very end. If you're doing an interview, is there an information leaflet that's included as the appendix? Do you have the certification of research ethics training? Are all the boxes ticked? That's what the screening is. It's not looking at the ethical review. It's just simply making sure that the form is complete and it is ready for review. If it's not ready for review, then it is essentially returned back to the applicant to address whatever is outstanding. Okay, so that's what happens. If it is ready for review, then what happens then is we need to then decide, look, well, when I say decide, it's in the application itself, but what type of application is it? Is it minimal risk or is it full ethical review? So minimal risk, if it's a minimal risk application, what happens then is the application is assigned to a chairperson. So we have two chairpersons for the HREC. We have Dr. Tom Farley and Dr. Anya DeRocha are the chairpersons for the HREC. So when it comes to a minimal risk application, it is assigned to one chairperson and two HREC members. In the HREC, we have roughly 25, 26 members, so which is quite a big committee that we have. And we use those numbers to our advantage by distributing the workload. So we don't have all members reviewing every application, because that just wouldn't be very efficient, wouldn't be very productive. So what we do is we assign applications to members based on discipline, based on the research context and stuff like that, okay? And the minimal risk then is reviewed by this chairperson and the two HREC members remotely. Okay, so it's kind of done on a rolling basis, and that's called out on the webpage as well. So there's no hard deadline for when a minimal risk application needs to be submitted by. Okay, it can be submitted when you have it, and then it follows this particular process. Okay, so it can be submitted at any time point. Okay, if the application that is submitted is full ethical review, is full ethical review, requires full ethical review or pre-approved procedure. I'll touch on what a pre-approved procedure is now in a couple of minutes, but if it's either one of those, well, then what happens is the application is assigned to both chairpersons and 2 or 3 HREC members. And then it is reviewed and it is discussed at the monthly meeting. Okay, so that's why if you check out the webpage, you'll see that there's hard deadlines for when full ethical review applications need to be submitted by if you want them reviewed at a particular meeting. Okay, so that's how we kind of work with the 2 applications that we have. So the minimal risk is done remotely. It's done kind of on a rolling basis. Full ethical review to pre-approved procedure are reviewed at a monthly meeting. The decisions when it comes to this then, so when it comes to a decision from either type of process here, it is then going to be ratified by the chairpersons. Okay, so the members come back with a decision, their opinion, and then the chairpersons would ratify that. And the decision will be one of 3. It will either be approved, it will be provisionally approved, or it will be resubmit. Okay, if it's approved, what that then means is you get a letter of approval and a HREC approval number, and you can have sometimes that approval number is required when you might be looking to publish your results at a later point. Journals sometimes require but it doesn't necessarily call it HREC, but they require kind of research ethics committee approval numbers. Okay, so that's the first one. If your application is provisionally approved, well, what that means is there's these minor tweaks that need to be kind of picked up on. So those tweaks could either be requirements or recommendations. So then it's on you, the applicant, to review, address those requirements and recommendations. And we have a document to actually help with that, with recording that information. And then you resubmit the application, but it's resubmitted for a chairperson. So it doesn't matter whether it's a minimal risk or full ethical review. If the outcome is provisionally approved, you go make your changes, you address the requirements, recommendations, and then it goes, you resubmit it to the HREC, but it just goes to the chairperson, okay, for their sign off. Okay, so it doesn't go back to a monthly meeting if it's a full ethical review application. Where it does go back to a monthly meeting if it's a full ethical review application is if it's a resubmit. Okay, so you've requirements, recommendations that I suppose the cumulative are probably more than minor. So that's kind of where you have, I don't know, would you necessarily say major corrections? It can vary, not major, I wouldn't say corrections, but requirements and recommendations, but there's a significant enough volume that it requires a resubmission. And if it's a resubmission and if it's a full ethical review application, well, then it's reviewed at the next monthly meeting. If it's a minimal risk, then it just goes back to the reviewers to make sure that the requirements and recommendations that they outlined have been met. Okay, so that's the process there. And I suppose just a small bit of a caveat down on the bottom left-hand side of the screen is very much appreciate that. Like, I hope you'd agree as well that there are multiple I suppose the document, the procedure itself, there are multiple steps to it. It's near impossible to summarize it concisely in one slide, but hopefully this kind of gives a flavor to the procedure. If you're looking at how these arrows all join up and the steps in between, obviously the procedure is there on the webpage to actually look at. Okay, I have two more slides, and then I'm going to pause just to see if there are any questions, and then we can kind of go again. Okay. The other one then to be aware of is the procedure for external research requesting access to MTU participants. Now, when I say MTU research participants, that's students, that's staff. Okay, so what happens in this case? Well, what happens here, and this is what the procedure calls out, is that the researcher here, and it will be said in the box down on the bottom left when it appears, is that's your external researcher. Okay, so the external researcher contacts the HREC to request access to research participants at the university. Again, research participants is very broad, but basically contacting people that are affiliated with MTU. The first question will be, is there research ethical approval from the host institution? So does this external researcher have research ethical approval? If the answer is no, well, then they're more likely going to be pointed towards the procedure that was on the previous slide, that they'd have to go through the whole process here. Now, there's definitely a question mark. Well, why would they not have ethical approval in their host institution, especially if it's a HEI or a research performing organization? Surely there would be ethical approval there first. So really, in reality, they should be going back there first. But there can be just a few exceptions to it. So this is look how we're capturing it at the moment. Okay. If they do have ethical approval from the host institution, well, then what the HREC administrator, Lydia, would request is that for their letter of approval and for the application that they would have submitted to their HREC or equivalent. Okay, so we'd like to see their application and their letter of approval. And then that documentation is sent to the chairpersons for their review. The chairpersons then make a decision on it. And the decision will be either they'll accept it, as in they'll accept the review that has been done on it, or they'll not accept it as in it's unclear or ambiguous. If they accept it, okay, that's not the end of it. Okay, so think of the process there so far. What the chairpersons have seen now are this other committee's letter of approval and the applicant's application. Okay, the external researcher's application. I suppose there's nothing there that kind of capturing the MTU approval bit then yet. Okay, so what we'd require there, and we'll show this now when I look at the minimal risk and full ethical review application forms, is we'd require then this external researcher to complete the minimal risk application form, but only the applicable parts of it. So not the whole application form, only just certain parts of it. Okay, and I will demonstrate that. I'll show that then. Okay, if this external researcher wants to gain access to MTU participants, but the chairpersons feel that, look, it's not at the standard that we'd have, the ethical review hasn't met, or I suppose isn't stringent enough for the MTU standards, well, then the researcher then will be invited to go through our actual process. Okay, in this case, that's how we would handle it. Now, the one thing then to be aware of this, we'll just say the external researcher wants to gain access to a certain cohort of students. We'll say cohort of students that are from a particular school. I won't name out any school, but just for a particular school in the university. Just because they have approval from the HREC, that doesn't mean that they can go off then and do it, because there's a certain gatekeeper. There is a gatekeeper to a particular school. So I'm using just a school as an example. So there's a gatekeeper to wherever the unit or the center is that these participants are in. And that gatekeeper needs to give approval as well. Okay, so when you look at this kind of one over in the top right-hand side there, you can see that I have an asterisk in it. And the asterisk then is just outlined here in the box down in the bottom left, whereby when HREC approval is granted, so when the chairpersons then would notify the head of function to say that there is this external researcher that is looking to gain access to the research participants within their unit, whatever that unit is. And that it satisfies the ethical concerns that the HREC may have. But the head of function may say no, may say, look, that the students or the staff have been inundated with research studies, we just can't do anymore, and that's completely within the right. So I suppose what I'm trying to capture here, and this is called out in more detail in the procedure, is there's kind of the ethical review aspect of an external researcher wanting to gain access to MTU participants. But then there's also this kind of gatekeeper approval that needs to be sought as well. Okay, and that is called out in the procedure. So just because they've got ethical approval doesn't mean that it can just happen. Now, sometimes the ethical approval and the process there, the gatekeeper is actually involved in that. Sometimes they nearly go hand in hand, but it's not a given. And it's basically before the applicant, the external researcher, is kind of giving the thumbs up to proceed, there has to be gatekeeper approval as well. Okay. Last slide, and then I'm just going to stop there, okay, to look at any questions, because then the next bit is I just want to go to the webpage just to navigate our way through the webpage. Is I mentioned there about pre-approved procedures. Okay, so the idea to a pre-approved procedure, I suppose there's lots of different ways it could be used, but I suppose the two main ways that we'd see how these could be used going forward is it's called out in our policy, or in our human research ethics policy, that if a research study involves human participants and is part of an undergraduate or taught postgraduate research, it needs to be done at a minimal risk level. That is called out in our policy. Now, if something is beyond minimal risk, well, then by right, it shouldn't be happening in the undergraduate or taught postgraduate research. Now, I said I'm not finished that now yet, because that's obviously quite a bold statement to make. By right, if it's beyond minimal risk, it would need to go to the HREC. But then in reality, timelines probably don't suit the study, because there's obviously very tight timelines for an undergraduate or taught postgraduate research. You know, that to go through the ethical review process, that could maybe be half their study time. So that might not be feasible. It is very possible in particular domains that the research that is done on undergraduate and taught postgraduate level is by default beyond minimal risk. So what we would feel in a scenario like that is what should be looked at and what should be agreed is a procedure to how that research that is being carried out at undergraduate and taught postgraduate research level that involves human participants but is beyond minimal risk, how it would be carried out. and that procedure would go to the HREC for a decision and hopefully approval. And then that procedure can be then leveraged by the supervisor for undergraduate, postgraduate research study, and it will reduce it then to minimal risk, so it can be handled at academic unit level. And I hope that makes sense what I said there. So basically, you're outlining how you plan on doing the procedure, or the research study that is beyond minimal risk. And if that will be outlined in a pre-approved procedure, there's a template for it. If that's approved then by the HREC, then you could use that. And so now you're looking at a study that's beyond minimal risk, but you're going to comply with a particular procedure to that study, which would then reduce it to minimal risk, and it can be handled at academic unit level. There's a lot of information there, but I'm happy to kind of take any questions on that. Okay, and there are pre-approved procedures that have gone through the process, and they're up on the webpage as well, so you can kind of see, look, what has actually been happened so far, and you can maybe you can use that as guidance. And there's more actually in train at the moment. The other thing for the procedures is that it can may be useful. Now, this doesn't have to be the case, but it may be useful that a particular researcher might find that they regularly carry out the same type of research. They do the same research, but the participants change and so on like that. So they're different studies, but the studies generally have the same type of research design, same type of data collection, so on like that. So what could be useful there for that researcher is that if they outline the procedure to how they carry out their atypical research, they let that procedure go to the HREC. The HREC then make a decision, ideally, hopefully prove it in time, and then going forward, that researcher then can leverage the procedure whereby they'd say, look, I'm going to abide by this particular procedure, so that would then reduce their study to as something that will be minimal risk, and they can do an expedited minimal risk form. So I have a screen grab here. We're going to open up the minimal risk form at the moment, but this is a section of a minimal risk application form. And down here, does the study follow a pre-approved procedure? If it does, then skip to section C, question 9, complete that, and job done. Okay, so it allows kind of an expedited review of your actual application. Now, that second bullet, that's kind of more I suppose, looking at probably staff that are doing research of a similar type year on year. So what they're doing is they're getting the procedure approved, and then they can leverage the procedure going forward, and that will give kind of an expedited review. But obviously, the expectation then is they comply with that procedure. And if they deviate from that procedure, that's shame on them. And then there's obviously has to be a follow-up from that. Okay, so that's where I am so far with that. Yeah, I'm going to stop there because there's been a lot of information there. The next part of this is to go to the web page and maybe just to navigate the way through the web page. But I'm happy to take questions if there are questions at the moment. Now, equally, there might be no questions, and that's fine as well.
There is one question in the chat, Sean.
Yeah, so okay, so I'll read it, I'll try to paraphrase. So I'm reading for the recording purposes. Okay, so can I just check for taught masters, as they don't go through the HREC, is it at the discretion of the department school how they manage this? But a potential approach for those projects that are minimal risk would be that. Okay, so first let's take that in stages. So is it at the discretion of the department school to manage this? Yes, that's essentially where it is at the moment. And look, if you have I'm not calling out the name for the sake of the recording as well, but if you have a follow-up, that's fine if you feel I haven't addressed that. So then obviously you're outlining an approach. So the department school would establish in the first instance, perhaps using human research ethics screening checklists if appropriate, if they are falling under minimal risk. And if they are, then the student would perhaps go to fill out the minimal risk human research ethics form, and they're reviewed, and if all is in order, on file. Yes, sorry, I know. I suppose I'm kind of scanning it just to see, look, where we're going with this. I mean, yes, I agree with all that. I'm happy to kind of have maybe a follow-up conversation just to make sure we're not missing anything here. But I mean, and again, for the purposes of the recording, the question was here, like, would this seem like an appropriate procedure maybe for within a department or a school that they would establish in the first instance a screening checklist to kind of gauge, is the research study that's being carried out by the undergraduate at the undergraduate or top postgraduate level, is it minimal risk of full ethical review? So we do have a screening checklist, which is up on the webpage, and that's what's mentioned there in the comment, that they would use that first. And then based on that, if it's minimal risk, that they would complete the minimal risk application form, and it will be recorded then at the department and school level. And yes, that would be the case. That's essentially it. Perfect. No, that's absolutely fine with that. Okay, so what I'm going to do there is I'm just going to open up the web page. I just realized one thing there. Just 1 second there, because I just want to open up one document to have it ready as well there. Sorry, not Paul, 1 second there. Sorry, there was just, I wanted to have just a couple of Word documents opened to make this as smooth as possible, ideally. So let's see here. So I'm just going to go to the web page that we have here at the moment. Okay, so I know Lydia popped this link into the chat. So there's a lot of information on this web page, and I'm just going to navigate our way through it here, and happy to take any questions. Okay. So, and there's obviously the links to all those various documents that I've mentioned are actually on this web page as well. Okay, so first and foremost, I suppose, and I won't read out all the text or anything like that. I mean, but happy to take any questions if you feel I've gone too fast through it. So first and foremost, there is obviously the 2 application forms. So here's the minimal risk and the full ethical review. They were updated last academic year in June. They were approved by the Academic Council and the Research Council. So they're a version 2. So it's going to be important that you use version 2 going forward, because they're an improvement on version 1. Just kind of a couple of bits of feedback that we got both from HREC members and from applicants, just maybe to how to maybe tighten up a small bit. So there have been tweaks. So it's important going forward, especially after this session, that version 2 is used. Okay. It's sometimes, obviously, it's unclear to whether your study would be minimal risk or full ethical review. So we have a screening checklist, which is a guideline document to help guide you, obviously, to what type of application form you may require. It can be sometimes still maybe a bit grey, and that in that case, then you're best to reach out to the HREC for final guidance. But ideally now, it would be a case of where a bit of work was done beforehand, the checklist was reviewed, and maybe there's a bit of ambiguity still with the checklist, because it can't cover all scenarios, and then that's where you'd reach out to the HREC, okay? Then if I scroll down here, we have, it just outlines here that the minimal risks are done on a rolling basis. I'll just highlight that so you can just see here. The minimal risks are done on a rolling basis here, and as in no monthly deadline, while the full ethical review have the monthly deadline, and then here are the deadline dates, okay? And then I suppose here as a guideline, okay, and it does vary, but I suppose when we were trialing the procedures last academic year, we were telling how long it takes. And I suppose what we're finding on average, the time it takes for your first outcome letter. Now, your first outcome letter as an applicant, what you would receive is an outcome letter that could be approval, could be provisionally approved, or could be resubmit. On average, it should be kind of within 5 weeks. Now, that can sometimes be a bit less. There's been a couple of anomalies where it'd be a bit more, but on average, it's around 5 weeks for that first outcome letter. Now, that first outcome letter obviously then dictates how long afterwards, as in if it's approval, that's job done. If it's not approval, provisionally approved, resubmit, that's on you then to kind of, we'll see how long does it take to maybe do that resubmission. So that's why we gave an indicative timeline for the first outcome letter. Okay, it's important to say, just because you just say you have an application submitted on a particular deadline and you make the cut, which is great. But if there's a lot of changes to the application, this goes back to the whole NCT comment. If there's a lot of changes that or amendments need to be made to the application, it is very possible that it just won't be progressed at that next monthly meeting. So you might have met the deadline, but if the application isn't really fit for a review, it may have to be delayed for the next monthly meeting. Okay, so just obviously, if there's a few minor tweaks that need to be made, we're allowing for that. Lydia obviously allows for that. But if there's a lot of tweaks that need to be done, we need to kind of keep progressing with this. So we can't wait for all those tweaks if they're significant, and you just may have to wait then to the following month. Okay. Then when I come down here to the additional information, so just things that, so the first one is just kind of, I suppose, a couple of bullets for yourselves to what to pay attention to, or look, what's our responsibility as researchers when we're going through the ethical review process. Then here in the HREC accordion, what we have is the information on the 2 procedures. Okay, so the 2 procedures that I tried to summarize there, and those 2 kind of infographics or flow diagrams, they're obviously more detailed here. And then there's obviously a HREC, which have a particular terms of reference, and the HREC do work to that terms of reference. And this here is your HREC membership. Okay, so that's that one. Then if you come to the resources, and I'll talk to them here, and then I'll share my screen just to kind of navigate my way through them. But here are various resources that we have. So this first one is if you have approval and something happens in the, and I don't say something happened as a negative, but as in there's a change, excuse me, to your research study or how you're carrying it out, that it has an ethical implication. We have an amendment form that you can use. So you'd complete this amendment form and then email it to the HREC, and it would go from there. And it all depends on the amendments. The amendments will be something quite minor, which will be overseen by the chairperson. But if the amendments are quite significant, then it could be a case of that you might have to do a new ethics application form. But your first step is to complete the amendment form and to submit it to the HREC. The second bullet that you can see on my screen there is the end-of-study report form. It's very concise. It's literally, look, and I'll share it here, but I'll share it now in a minute or two. But it's basically, look, name, supervisor, timelines, and identifier. We're not looking for research outputs or anything like that. Like, that's not the function of the HREC. We're literally looking at trying to just close the loop to approval was given, study is done. That's all. The next one then is an outcome letter. So if you end up, your feedback is provisionally approved or resubmit, what we require then is when you are making amendments to your application, that you summarize those amendments that you've made in this application form. Okay, so sorry, in this third bullet. So how have you addressed the requirements that the HREC have asked, the recommendations that the HREC have asked? How are you addressing that? You summarize it in this application form, and then with this with this response form, and then with the response form, along with your updated application, you resubmit that to the HREC. And any changes that you make, and it's called out in this document, but any changes that you make to your application based on being provisionally approved or resubmit need to be highlighted. Okay, so because the re-review isn't looking at the application from start to finish anymore. That has been done. It is just to look at what are the requirements and recommendations and have they been addressed. There's obviously a lot. I look fully aware that first time to completing a research ethics application form, it may be very overwhelming. I'm very much aware that may be the case. There are resources available to help support completing a research ethics application form. They're up on a Canvas module. Access to the Canvas module vary depending on what campus you're based in. So if you're in the Cork campus, red button, blue campus, Kerry button, and then you can get access to this module. And it's essentially a repository of resources first and foremost. And resources are essentially videos, short videos, most 15 minutes long, and slide decks in relation to certain aspects of the application process. Okay, there is an option there about if you wanted to get access and do an assessment, you can get a digital badge of it. I'll just keep that separate, the idea of a digital badge, because look, I'm happy to take any questions. But first and foremost, there are resources available that you have a repository of resources to help with the review, with the application process. Okay. The next accordion then to look at is just the pre-approved procedures. So this hopefully will be something that will be very helpful in time. Okay. So you said I've spoken already about the pre-approved procedures, the idea to it, so I won't repeat that, but I'm happy to take any questions. But what we have here is we have 6 procedures that have actually been approved now by the HREC at this point. And these are procedures that you can leverage yourself going forward. Okay, you could decide, look, that you're going to be carrying out focus groups, and maybe the focus groups that you're going to carry out are very in line with the procedure that has been used for focus groups with Unshaw. And you can use that procedure then if you want in your application form. And I showed the screen grab on the slide deck of where that particular section is. I'll actually share my slide, the minimal risk application form to show that. And that expedites the whole review process. If you're saying, look, you're going to comply with a particular procedure, then that saves time, because these procedures, they outline how you're going to acquire the data, how you're going to store it, what's going to happen at the end of the research study, how do you get informed consent, how do you control for withdrawing, debriefing, all those aspects of an ethical review are covered in these procedures. Then there's a template. So going forward, you could say, look, that these 6 procedures, they don't work for me. I'd like to write one specific to my discipline. Absolutely no problem. There's a template for you to complete for that. Okay, so it's like an application form, but specifically designed for a pre-approved procedure. And how that is treated is very similar to the full ethical review application form, that it goes to the monthly meeting. Okay. And the last thing then on this one, and then I'll stop sharing, wait for questions, and I might share a couple of documents there, Word documents that I have opened, is the training. So part of when you're submitting your research ethics application form, it's a requirement called out in our policy that you have evidence of research ethics training. And here is a link to a document to kind of give examples of the research ethics training that we have within the university. One being, there's a training module up in Epigeum, part of the specialist, so not part of the research integrity core, it's part of research integrity specialist modules. And when you click on that, there's a screen grab in the document. There's a module for research involving human participants, and that's evidence. Equally, the Canvas module that I mentioned up above, you can kind of do an assessment as part of that. If you wanted to now gaining access to the module, doesn't mean you were required to do the assessment. First and foremost, the module is a repository of resources. But if you wanted to go an extra step, you can do an assessment. Pass the assessment, you get a digital badge. That digital badge then works as evidence of research ethics training. Okay. And then this last one is on that one. You may have done a module on research ethics in a previous, hopefully now, not necessarily 20 years ago, but maybe in the last 5 years, something like that. That can be considered. So there's, other scenarios can be considered on a case-by-case basis, and that's called out in that document as well. Okay. So look, I'll stop there now again, and I think there's one question. Is there?
There's one question in the chat.
Perfect. Yeah. So I suppose, yeah. So I'll read it out again, sorry, for the purposes of the recording. So one of the feedbacks from our MSc students was that the application form is not well suited to action research. Is there any possibility of more tailored application forms? So I suppose my first question there was, when we say an MSc students, is that research MSc students or taught program MSc students? Maybe taught. So first, as mentioned in the policy, the ethical review for taught programs is handled at academic unit level. So at academic unit level, you could decide that you want to use a particular application form. At the moment, you might want to decide that you might want to tailor the application form to your own needs, and that is completely within your right. Yeah, perfect. Now there may be, and there's work ongoing to have a unitary application process for taught programs, undergraduate and taught research. So that's work that's ongoing at the moment, but that's not a policy or anything like that. So essentially handled at academic unit level. So that's fine. Okay, we're doing okay at time here. So basically my plan here for the last bit is just to show a couple of the documents that we have, and just maybe because that might spur on a couple of questions, or equally the rest of the time can be taken up on answering questions. But I don't see any questions coming in there. So I'm going to be sharing on and off my screen here just to look at different parts. Okay, so let's look at I'm going to open up the minimal risk application form here, because there's just one or two bits I want to show. So it's important. So that should be on the screen there. Yeah. So it's important, especially like this is a version 2 application form. So this is kind of a new application, updated application form. So if it's your first time completing this application form, it is important to read that first page of where it's outlining, look, what you're expected to do, okay? What you're expected to include in your application in terms of what should be included in the appendix. I won't read it all out here. You can read it yourself, but it is important that you read that first page. I fully appreciate that if when it comes to maybe your 10th or 20th application on a version 2, you don't need to read that first page. But when it's the first or second, it is important to read that first page to make sure nothing's missed, okay? Then the application form, we've just rejigged it a small bit from the previous one of where the study details, the applicant details, that they're kind of front-loaded, supervisor details, they're front-loaded really in the application. In the previous version, they were kind of later on, okay? And I'm not going to go through the whole application, but I just want to kind of show 2 parts to it. So the first thing is if the study has ethical approval already. So I just want to highlight this maybe first here. So if the study has ethical approval already, so this is kind of more applicable to maybe external researchers looking to gain access to MTU participants. This is what will be used. Or maybe you're part of a research team that had a part of a research team with external collaborators. Ethical approval has got somewhere else, but you're part of the team. and now you want to use the approval that you got somewhere else within MTU. So now you're to a certain extent the external researcher. This is what you would do, okay, as well. Okay, so this, and I suppose the reason I'm just highlighting this is if it has ethical approval somewhere else and it has gone through, the chairpersons are happy with it or are supportive of it, then you don't need to complete the full ethical review application. You just need to complete section C, question 8. Obviously, the bits before this, obviously the pages previous. But now when you come here, if you tick this box, then you go to section C, question 8. Okay, and it's very similar here. If I just want to, this one, if you're working with a pre-approved procedure as well, I just color code that here like this. Similar idea. You complete the application form, you come up to this point. If you're working off a pre-approved procedure, you tick this box and it tells you to go to section C, question 9. Okay, so you don't need to worry, not necessarily worry, but the rest of these bits have already been covered in the pre-approved procedure. Now, if you're not going with a pre-approved procedure, if you're not looking at a study that already has ethical approval, then you're going through obviously the full application. And just to show you here, look, here's the question 8. So this is if you've approval somewhere else. So that's the one that you have here. I'll just highlight that, the yellow, that just aligns with there. And then if you're working off a pre-approved procedure, then this is what you have here. Okay. And then after that, you sign it at the very end. At the very end, and that's that bit done. Okay. So I'll stop there because I see there's another. Is there another question there? Yeah, no, that's fine.
No, there isn't.
No, that's perfect. That's fine. And then I just have a couple of others there I'll share just to see now. I have so many documents open here. So let's show. That's perfect. Okay, so here is the end of study report form. And I suppose this is when your study is finished. It is part of it's called out in the policy that the HREC should be notified of this. And it is a very short form. Okay, we're not looking at recording any major information. It's basically what's your approval number, when did you get this approval, study title, the name of the applicant, the PI, and you're just calling out here. It's just a statement that how you're managing your data is aligned with what you said in your ethics application form. Because if it's not aligned, well, then technically that should have been an amendment to your ethics application form, which should have been called out previous. Okay, so in the end of study report form, when you sign this off, you're agreeing that however you've outlined the data is being managed, whether it be in an open data repository, destroyed, archived, or other, that you're sticking with that. And if you feel during your study that you can't stick with that, that's an amendment to your ethics application form. That is an amendment, which is a separate one here. Okay, so that's that one. I'll just close this actually because that will help. Perfect. And I'm just going to, that's the main is. So the other one then I want to show would be, we'll just say the amendment one. So if you have gone through the ethical review process and it's been approved, but now your research study has changed and the changes have ethical implications, then we have an amendment form for you to complete. The first section is basically very similar to the end of study report, just kind of giving the particular details on your application. And then it's a case of here, look, how is your application? How is your study changing? Has the research team changed? The reason that's important is if the research team has changed, then the new members need to have the research ethics training. Sorry, I lost my words there, but the new members need to have the certification of research ethics. So that's what that's been called out. Or how are you accessing participants differently? Is consent being got differently? Is withdrawing information without the right to withdraw? Is it being done differently? Again, I won't read it all there, but you can see, hopefully you'd agree, it's relatively straightforward. You tick which scenario you are, and then you outline it to look why has there been a change. And then that is sent to the HREC, and it should be turned around fast enough. But obviously just do allow time, for this. I mean, they can't all be expedited, so it's just allow a bit of time for that, okay? So that's the amendment form. And I think I just have one more I want to show you, and maybe two more actually. Oh yes, this is actually, yeah, two more. So sorry, no. So here's the next one, which is your response form. So just when you submit your research ethics application, it will either be approved, provisionally approved, or it will be resubmit. They will be the decisions. If it's provisionally approved or resubmit, then that means you need to return with information. You need to address requirements or recommendations, okay? And the letter that you get will outline what the requirements and recommendations are. So when it comes to the requirements, like what we're looking to do here in this letter response form is you copy and paste the requirement that was made in here. You outline then how you addressing that. okay, here, and then you move on to your next requirement and then your next response. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean you have 4 requirements, but this is obviously just kind of giving enough information. But that's what you do here. And then equally, when it comes to the recommendations, it's the same. You copy and paste in your recommendation how you're addressing it. When you're addressing it, you make reference to where in the application form it's being addressed, okay? And also, it just calls out here that when you're resubmitting your application form, make sure it's highlighted in yellow. Okay, the changes are highlighted in yellow, because that just speeds up the review process. Because when the reviewers, whether it's the chairpersons or the HREC members, are reviewing a provisionally approved application that comes back in or a resubmission that comes back in, it's only the requirements and recommendations that are being addressed in that case. So if you can kind of if you signpost them as easy as possible, that helps. And if it's not signposted, if it's not highlighted, it will just be returned to you. It doesn't progress. Okay, that's that one. And then the last one then is just around the procedure. So if you find that you want to leverage a procedure going forward yourself, so we have a procedure document that's up on the web page, and here there's the various headings. There's kind of a bit of guidance between them as for how to complete it. Okay, so what's the part? And you obviously, there are pre-approved procedures up there that you can look at them to what information that they put in. But here you have an overall section about the purpose, what is the description of the procedure, the participants, how the participants. And then how do you do the procedure? Like, how are you getting consent? How's the data being collected? You outline all these parts. I won't read them all out. And in the appendix, you put in, if it's a questionnaire or focus groups, you put in the indicative questions. You call those things out. You give in indicative information sheets and so on like that. Okay. So a good bit covered now in this, no doubt. There's been a lot of work done behind the scenes for this. So again, a quick summary for this. I suppose it's the first part of this session here was just outlining the procedures that we're working with and the procedures that had been road tested last academic year, but now are formally approved by the Research Council and Academic Council. And the second part of this workshop, information session, was just kind of navigating the way through the web page and seeing all the various resources and forms that are there. Okay, and I'm happy to take questions if anyone has them, and if not, then that's absolutely fine as well. Okay, that's perfect. Okay, super. Look, thanks everyone. This session here obviously is being recorded, and we'll upload the video to the web page as well. Okay, so that'll be done in the next week or two, so that it can be there going forward as well as a point of reference. Okay, so that's it. So thank you so very much, everyone. Hope you have a nice lunch.